Hello there, listeners. This is an audio recording of my book, The Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand, which is book 1 in the Westwind Tales series. If you like what you hear, consider subscribing, leaving a like or a comment, or preferably all of the above. If you want more content like this, consider supporting the channel by purchasing my book on Amazon, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or, preferably, both. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea, and enjoy the chapter. Kel recognized Brandon's excited voice. The innkeeper's words grew a small bit louder, as if he was trying to prove a point to someone who wasn't taking him seriously. Kel stopped on the stairs just before the common room doorway. He pressed up against the wall and listened to the conversation taking place about him. "I still find it hard to believe," whined a skeptical-sounding voice, though a hint of laughter could be detected in the words, "a Kel warrior waltzing into your inn, of all places, and demanding a room for the night. It sounds to me like you are trying to build a little reputation for your declining business." "Well, he didn't demand a room for the night," spluttered Brandon. "Actually, he didn't really say anything at all." "Well, there you are," exclaimed the second, still with a hint of mirth. "A man walks into your inn and says nothing. And what do you assume? That he is part of a mythical sect of nomadic knights, and that it's your sole duty to help him on his quest? It sounds to me like you have been sitting behind that desk for too long, my friend." There was a pause in the conversation, then Brandon spoke up again. "He was wearing the Argonaut on his right hand. He had silver hair and eyes. What's more, he didn't speak a word to me, even when I asked him his name. What was I supposed to think?" "Brandon," the other voice spoke softly. The mirth had vanished. "He was probably some traveler who bought a shiny ring from a peddler along the road. There are no Kel left alive. The Argonaut never existed in the first place. It is simply a bedtime story for small children, a fairy tale. You need to let this fantasy of yours go. Your business suffers because you spend all your money and time buying books filled with rumors at outrageous prices, every time a trader that floats down the flow claims to have something new." Here the man's voice began to grow louder as his tone escalated with annoyance. "Your family keeps tightening their belts while you spend your money on some silly hobby that is turning you into an obsession." There was an uncomfortable silence in the room as the man paused in his tirade to take a breath. Kel peered around the corner of the staircase and through the open door. Brandon stood with his broad back to Kel. His apron was tied around his waist in a neat bow. The man with whom he was talking stood in front of him, facing Kel. He was pinching the bridge of his nose with a thumb and forefinger. His eyes squinted shut as he took a deep breath. He wore a thick woolen shirt which was green and long in the sleeves. Thick red hair covered his head and was pulled back behind his ears and held in place by a messy knot of twine. He stood not quite as tall as Brandon, and certainly not as broad in the shoulders. However, he still looked as though he had seen his share of hard work. His face was chiseled by lack of excess fat, and his folded arms swelled with muscle. He began again in a gentler tone. "Look, Brandon, I understand that you believe you have some connection with the fountain statue, and who knows, perhaps you really do. But regardless, you need to start thinking about your family." He gestured with his hand toward the staircase. Kel ducked back into the shadows as the man continued. "You said that you gave him the room upstairs, one of your best rooms, I might add, for however long he wanted. Did you even charge him?" Kel peered out again and saw Brandon shaking his head as he stared at the floor. His hands were clasped in front of him. From the angle at which Kel was watching, it looked rather like a father reprimanding a foolish child. "You gave him one of your best rooms to use indefinitely and didn't charge him anything, all because you mistook him for someone out of one of your fairy tales. Do you see what I'm getting at here, Brandon? You barely make enough to keep this place running and support your family in the first place. And now this?" Kel backed away up the stairs and sat on the landing of the second floor. He kept listening. "I understand what you're saying, Jupe," said Brandon in a subdued tone. "I guess I hadn't realized it had gotten that bad. My family is really tightening their belts because of me?" "They are," responded Jupe. "Every time I see your son with the other children, he's not smiling. The boy's only 5 years old, Brand. He shouldn't be going hungry." "What should I do then, Jupe? I can't just kick the man out of the room. I gave it to him on my word. I can't just go back on it and tell him to be off." "You're going to have to think of something, Brand. Look, I dropped off the flour you ordered in the back behind the kitchen. I have to get back to the mill. Take care of yourself, all right? And your family, too." "You're right, I suppose, Jupe. You usually are." "Thank you. I'll try to think of something. So long, Brand. I'll see you around." The sound of the common room door opening snapped Kel out of the stupor he had sunken into as he had listened. This added a new problem to his already growing collection. Now he had to find a place to stay while he searched the town. Unfortunately, just as Kel had no memories, he also had no money. He supposed that with his ring and what he had just overheard, he could somehow trick Brandon into believing that he was a Kel something or other again, and into letting him keep the room. But also, judging from what he had just heard, that would be nothing short of cruel. He would have to find a different place. Thinking quickly, Kel stood up and trotted back down the stairs and into the common room. A despondent-looking Brandon stood leaning over the counter, half-heartedly polishing it with a rag as he stared off into nothing. At the sound of Kel entering the room, he started and looked up. Kel tossed the metal key to Brandon, who caught it with a surprised look on his face. "I don't think I'll accept your offer of the room, sir." Brandon's mouth began to work, but no sound came forth. He seemed genuinely confused, not only at Kel talking, but also at being referred to as Sir. Kel continued, "It was a generous offer, but I think that I'll lay my head somewhere else for tonight. Thank you for your hospitality, sir." He crossed the room and pulled the door open, and made to exit, but stopped when he felt a hand on his arm. He looked around and saw that Brandon had dashed around the corner and was now holding onto his elbow with a large hand. They both looked at each other for a moment before Brandon blushed and removed his hand off Kel's arm. "Please, sir, I mean, who are you?" Kel paused with his hand on the door handle. "Like you said, Brandon, my name is Kel." He stepped out of the Knight's Head and into the square. His shoes slapped on the brick road as Kel walked away from the inn. The fountain loomed just ahead and cast a long shadow eastward toward the town's entrance. Kel turned to his left, his back to the statue, and headed out toward the western edge of Rockford. Jupe had said that he worked at a mill. Perhaps he could ask for a place to stay. "Or maybe I can find a farm outside of town that will let me stay in exchange for work," he mumbled to himself. Kel didn't even know if Rockford had any farms. Jupe had mentioned that traders used the Morgan Flow as a trade route. Regardless of whether there were farms or not, Kel figured that the miller would have an idea or two about what he could do. Realizing he hadn't seen which direction Jupe had gone after leaving the inn, Kel stopped in the middle of the road to think. A few people were walking up and down the streets, each headed to some destination of their own, some business to take care of. Several townsfolk glanced up at Kel as he stood there. Others ignored him. No one spoke to him. He was an outsider, after all. And unless he provided any means of making money, he was of little importance to the residents of Rockford. One thing was for certain, though. They all noticed him. "The mill will be on the riverbank," Kel grunted to himself, and started walking again towards the edge of town. Passing shops on the road as he ambled along, Kel glanced into the large windows and took note of the layout of the town. The fountain stood at the east end of Rockford, where the main road entered town. That was where the older buildings were. Therefore, he assumed, where the former town had once stood. As he walked onward, he saw that the shops and houses were made of less and less of the ancient stone, and increasingly more of the red bricks common to the buildings of the younger part of town. As Kel left the center of town, the buildings became more spread out and less uniform, and the low rush of running water drifted through the houses to his ears. Soon, the street forked off to his left and turned back up toward the middle of town, where he had come from. At the fork, there stood a long building, with a wide chimney running up its far side, spilling forth wisps of black smoke. That, along with the sign hanging near the doorway, identified the place as a smithy. A punctuated ring of metal striking metal suddenly began. Kel turned his back to the smithy and continued down the road, leaving the fork behind. The sound of water gradually increased, and as the road turned, the town opened up to reveal the eastern bank of the Morgan Flow. The road continued to the edge of the river, rising slightly as it encountered an old stone bridge spanning the width of the river. Kel stopped at the edge of the water and gazed out over the rush. The bridge was supported by large stone pillars that were cut into triangular points on either side in an attempt to divide the running water and prevent it from wearing away at the bridge's foundation. The section of the Morgan that ran past Rockford was only about as deep as Kel's waistline, and the bridge rose several feet above the water in a perfect arch. The Morgan was dotted with many large boulders, some of which poked out above the surface and caused the water to form small eddies as it swirled around them. The top of the bridge was paved with red brick in the same fashion as the rest of the road that wound through Rockford, but the rest of it was constructed from the ancient gray stone found in the older buildings and the fountain in the town square. The water was clear, and its stones were a reddish brown. With the sound of rushing water filling his ears, Kell turned northward and wandered up the bank, following a small, unpaved path with wagon ruts. The path led him through a stand of poplars to an open area on the river's bank. On the edge of the water stood a large rectangular building. Out of the west side of the building, there protruded a metal axle on which turned a massive wooden wheel. Kell could hear the creak of wood and the scrape of stone coming from the inside of the mill. Outside the double doors in the front of the mill, a cart stood, propped up on a block of wood. On the far side of the mill, there was a large fenced-in lawn with several trees scattered throughout. A gray pony, still in its tack, stood against the gate with its ears pointed forward, gazing out curiously at Kell. On impulse, he raised his hand and waved in the horse's direction. "Hello there." Seemingly unimpressed, it huffed and turned around and plodded off into the shade of the trees. "He's not a really friendly horse." Kell flinched at the voice and turned to see Jupe standing in the arch of the double doors of the mill. He leaned up against the doorframe and put his right hand on his hip as he looked Kell over. "You must be Brand's Kell. Now that I see you, I suppose I don't blame him for his assumption." Kell shuffled awkwardly in place, trying to figure out how to proceed. He hadn't really thought of what he was going to say when he finally reached the mill. He supposed that simply telling Jupe that he had no memory of who he was would be a bad way to start. Jupe continued, cutting off Kell's line of thought. "You want something, or did you just wander down the back entrance to my mill to enjoy the view?" The sarcasm in Jupe's voice was apparent. Kell took a breath and decided on his course of action. "Actually, I'm looking for a place to stay. I heard that you worked at a mill and was wondering if you could help me. I'd be willing to work for my lodging." Jupe stared at Kell with his piercing blue eyes. Kell wanted to look away, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact. He sniffed uncomfortably. "I'm generally not inclined to allow strangers to stay under my roof." Kell exhaled in disappointment. "However," Jupe continued, "I own a small farm down the road from here. The wheat I grow there is ready to be reaped. I can usually manage just fine on my own, but I hurt my back the other day. I'm still a bit sore. An extra set of hands would be appreciated. There's a room and a hot meal in it for you if you're up to it." A smile spread across Kell's face as he scratched at an itch at the back of his head. "That would be great. Thank you." Suddenly animated, Jupe beamed a smile at Kell and clapped his hands together. "Good." He turned and retreated into the mill. The doors closed behind him. When he didn't reappear, Kell rubbed his hands together and wet his lips. One of the doors reopened, and Jupe stuck his head and arm out. "Well, come on." And then he disappeared inside again. Kell chuckled and trotted over to the entrance of the mill. Grabbing a handle, he pulled open the door that Jupe had just closed and stepped inside. Kell's eyes adjusted to the dimly lit interior of the mill. Jupe was on the other side of a large millstone attached to a pole, which in turn was hooked to a maze of gears and axles, one of which was stuck through a hole in the wall of the mill, to the wheel on the outside. The whole apparatus turned the millstone in an oversized stone mortar, which was producing the loud grating sound that Kell had heard when he first arrived. The bowl of the mortar was filled with soft, white powder. Jupe reached over, out of Kell's line of sight, and pulled a lever that disconnected the millstone from the gears, ceasing its rotation. He tossed a tightly woven linen sack over the bowl to Kell, who caught it as it hit him in the face. "Here, use this." He handed him a wooden scoop with a handle on the end. "Get the flour out of the mortar and bag it. I'm going outside to hook the cart up to bear. There are more sacks over there under the bench." Jupe rubbed his hands together and headed out the door, muttering something under his breath. Kell watched him leave, then opened the sack and began scooping the flour out of the stone bowl. The flour puffed into the air as he worked. With every scoop, the air became whiter. He filled 3 torso-sized bags with the contents of the mortar. As he finished each one, he carefully placed it on the bench and retrieved a new bag. Jupe entered and coughed, waving a hand in the air in front of his face. He was laughing. "You look like a ghost, my friend." Although Kell couldn't see himself, he knew that with the combination of the flour on his clothes and skin, and the natural color of his hair and eyes, he must strike an interesting picture indeed. He smiled and began to laugh with Jupe, but the flour in the air threw him into a fit of coughing. Jupe laughed again as he held up a linen mask in one hand. "I forgot to give this to you before you started," he grinned. "My name is Jupin, by the way. Jupin Hatcher. You can call me Jupe, though. My friends call me Jupe." Kell gasped a breath and introduced himself. They shook hands and smiled at each other. Kel started to cough again and pulled his hand away to cover his mouth. Jupe stifled a laugh as he turned his head and looked over at the stacks of flour lined up on the bench. "Oh, you filled these a bit too full. There should have been 4 bags even. No matter, just take some off the top each." Kel gave a cough of acknowledgement and bobbed his head. Moving over to the bench, he took up a 4th bag and began to scoop flour into it, out of the other 3. When he had finished this, Jupe walked over from the doorway. He was carrying 4 burlap sacks the same size as the linen ones. Kel stepped aside, began to dust himself off. This only made the air worse, so he stopped and stood in the corner as Jupe tied each of the linen sacks shut with twine, then stuffed each one into its own burlap sack. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a stout needle, through the eye of which he began to thread the twine. As he began to sew the burlap bags shut, he glanced up at Kel and smiled as his eyes took in the state of his clothes. "If you'd like to dust yourself off, you can go outside. This will take a few minutes." Kel nodded in thanks as he stepped out of the mill. Outside, the air was fresh and not filled with clouds of flour. Kel took a deep breath and began to dust off his clothes. He looked up from his shirt and saw that there was a group of about a dozen men, roughly 30 feet away. Some had their arms folded across their chests, while others had their hands tucked into their coat pockets. All of them wore scowls, and all of them were looking at him. Well, that wraps up this chapter. Stay tuned for the next chapter of the Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand coming soon. In the meantime, you can head over to Amazon and pick up your very own copy. The link is in the description. Leave a comment and a like, make sure to subscribe for more content, and until next time, enjoy the adventure.